Well, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with SP History, and we are beginning a new part of the Deep State series, and that is the national security apparatus that includes the Pentagon. We've been, I don't know, for several weeks now examining the part of the national security apparatus that includes the intelligence agency. Most people know it as CIA. And we started in 47, right on the conclusion. Actually, we went back into World War II with Allen Dulles and some of his shenanigans. But then we started in 47 with the National Security Act being passed, which created the CIA and went forward all the way up till, I think yesterday we got to 1970. And I'm purposely stopping in 1970 with respect to the CIA because I'm saving the Watergate scandal for the end. But the uh, the other part of the national security apparatus that we need to look at, or at least reference with respect to what's coming, specifically the JFK assassination, is the Pentagon. And so this is the section of the national security apparatus that includes all things military. There's a famous picture of Kennedy with the Joint Chiefs in the Oval Office. And one of the things that he's going to learn through the course of a relatively short presidency is that these Joint Chiefs are not uh, what we all think in terms of patriotism. They have an agenda. And in several cases, very prominent cases, it runs counter to the interests of the American people, which, of course, that's another part of this that I have tried to drive home the point that the private sector ultra vires doctrine has now become the operating principle of the entire national security apparatus, and indeed the entire deep state. Uh, Remember, ultra vires was acting in self-interest, maximize your own benefits or your own profits, and you disregard public interest, and then you create immunity for yourself, and so that all you're exempt from any and all liability. So we've seen that over and over again with respect to the CIA. That is also going to be true of the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs. Just a quick reminder of what deep state, how we've defined deep state. Deep state is the national security apparatus and all the industries that feed it. Today we'll look at a little bit of both of those, and then ultimately we've defined treason, which is what these deep state conspirators are engaged in during this period, as aiding and abetting the enemy. Number one. Number two, betraying one's country. Number three, overthrowing one's government. Number four, killing the king. So here you see the king right in the middle of this picture. And what he doesn't realize is that some of these men he's posing with, or being pictured with, are going to take part in a conspiracy to overthrow his government and indeed even have him killed. So, A2 Brutus, just like Julius Caesar. So let's talk about the history of the Pentagon and when it became this industrial complex, as Eisenhower called it. It was out of necessity. You know, in World War II, our allies were being bombarded with German bombs, specifically England. Russia was being burned, partly by them and partly by the Germans. And so our allies could not manufacture the military hardware needed to sustain the war effort. Meanwhile, we're sitting across two oceans protected, even though the Japanese got us at Pearl Harbor. The mainland itself is protected. And so we have this manufacturing capacity, even during peacetime, that our allies didn't have, but during wartime, especially. And so we ended up building more military hardware during World War II by itself, the United States did, than all the Axis powers combined. And of course, that includes our allies as well. The Axis powers, Japan, Germany, and Italy, were overwhelmed by the production miracle that came from the United States. One of the reasons why it's such a mistake to draw America into the war on Japan's part and for Germany to declare war shortly thereafter, because it brought into the war effort a manufacturing capability that they hadn't seen before and they just couldn't deal with. Um, it's it is the first time in recorded human history in a war that the nations that killed the most people lost to the nations who built the most stuff, emphasizing how important military hardware was in the course of a war. The Axis powers, when you take up and tally up all the deaths during a war, 80% of those killed by Axis powers. Japan, Germany, Italy killed 80% of the people who died in the war. That's pretty amazing. Meanwhile, the Allies built over 80% of the munitions in the war. And so what we discover as a result of World War II is that munitions, war materials, are more important than lives. And it used to be in the old days, your numbers, you could win a war of attrition through sheer numbers. Not anymore. Not anymore. There's an example, and I would encourage you, if you really want to read an expert on World War II, all things World War II, read a book by Victor Davis Hanson. He's got several on World War II, but he is better than anybody I've ever read, expert on these sorts of things. And so I would recommend Victor Davis Hanson. Example: America gave the Russians 2,000 locomotives and 375 Dodge trucks, which automized the war. Automated, I guess is the word I'm looking for, where before the Russians were fighting with horses, for example. There's a good anecdote. The Germans called the American hardware automatons or automatic robots, complaining that, quote, these damn Americans have motorized their divisions, and 70% of our divisions are still driven by horses. They have an oil war. We have a grass war. So you can see the distinction between our capabilities from a manufacturing standpoint and our enemies, and indeed even our allies. And so this, out of necessity, created what later became this unholy trinity. You had these multinational companies, these plutocrats. Sometimes people call them robber barons, but they became the power elites, the beginning of these deep staters, the CEOs, the lawyers, the investment bankers. We talked about, the CEOs are obvious, right? You're talking about the guys who own these big what later became multinational companies. At one time, they were headquartered and all their factories were here in the United States, but eventually they became multinational, which means they're relocating parts of their company and corporation overseas for cheaper labor, for close proximity to raw materials, et cetera, et cetera. And so they became multinational plutocrats, and their loyalties to America diminished over time because they weren't beholden to American politicians and America as a country anymore, because that's not where their companies were located. They were located all over. They had to be loyal to many different countries. So the patriotism quotient diminished over time as these companies spread out around the world. And we talked in this interwar period about some of these lawyers, like the Dulles brothers, representing these clients through Sullivan and Cromwell. We talked about the investment bankers at Brown Brothers Harriman, such as Prescott Bush, again, representing these CEOs and these multinational companies around the world. So that when a war comes, involves all these foreign countries, these multinational corporate CEOs, these plutocrats, their loyalties are divided. They're torn. That's the whole essence of Operation Sunrise, was to protect these multinational corporate assets in these countries overseas that were our enemies that were fighting against us. So they used the Dulles brothers, they used Prescott Bush and stuff to protect those assets and negotiate a secret peace, even though it was traitorous, it was treasonous, it was violating the direct order of the commander in chief. No matter, treason is not an issue. It's not a hang up to these guys because They consider themselves citizens of the world, more or less. Uh, this deep state also includes the national security apparatus, the federal bureaucracy, which are the politicians who vote the money, right? Who give the money to Department of Defense and spread it around amongst the government agencies. These cabinet level positions that have the authority or have the influence with Congress to pass these appropriations bills. It necessarily requires it. This is, by the way, the element of the deep state or the uh, military industrial complex that Eisenhower omitted. It was originally written into his speech, the military industrial congressional complex. He left it out because it was populated with all his friends. He didn't want to offend anybody. But you take the federal bureaucracy out of this deep state configuration, and it fades into oblivion. It goes away because all the source of the money is the American taxpayer, and it has to be voted in through these appropriations bills by these politicians. And then you've got the part of the national security apparatus that includes military and intelligence, and that would be the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs, the undersecretaries, the generals, and of course all the intel agencies. We've spent quite a bit of time on the CIA. We haven't spent as much time on the FBI because the FBI is domestic intelligence and law enforcement. But I started off by saying that the FBI was complicit in this national security apparatus, deep state, especially with regards to the assassination of JFK. And it was involved in the pre-planning and the post-investigation. It was involved in the cover-up. Didn't shoot anybody, but it was involved in the conspiracy nonetheless. And then when you spin it forward into the assassination of, say, Martin Luther King, for example, or Malcolm X, the FBI was more than involved. It was the driver of both of those assassinations, just as the CIA was the driver in the RFK assassination and uh, uh, so anyway, these are the entities we've used different names. We've called them the power elites. We've called them plutocrats. We've called them robber barons. Uh, the name that most people ascribe to them today is the deep state. It's the unaccountable, unelected uh, power elite that behind the scenes pulls all the strings and basically runs everything. And when you get right down to it, the driving force, the motivating factor is always money. It's always money and power. So, speaking of money, the world's largest office building, I think it still is. It was when I was in college, and maybe it's been passed since then. But at one time, this was the world's largest office building, and it represents American military might and power and wealth and all this. It's one of the reasons why in 9/11 it was targeted, right? This is the symbol worldwide, not just here in America, but worldwide. It is the symbol of American imperialist might, so to speak. And I'm sure in some pockets of the world there's a lot of resentment towards this symbol. But in these days, it was a symbol of a lot of money. And this is the era during which our government became corporatized. It's World War II era. At the request, and this had happened in World War I too, but not to the degree that it happened in World War II. At the request of President Roosevelt, the leaders of the industry and finance corporations, all these industry and finance leaders moved into the government to help with the war effort. And of course, they brought with them this private sector ultra vires doctrine, which I've explained earlier. And that became the new operating principle coming out of Washington. So no longer was there a line of distinction between public and private with respect to uh, how they acted towards the public interest. They are now on the same page, acting completely disregarding public interest in the pursuit of profits and the pursuit of maximizing the benefits to themselves. And and then they have immunity. It's even easier to get immunity now because you have the government in your pocket. So they control the Justice Department. They control uh, Congress and the legislative process. They control the judges, right? So DC was taken over during this World War II era by business executives, by Wall Street lawyers, investment bankers, and the all-consuming goal or objective of this new corporatized government was to maximize profits or benefits at the expense of the American taxpayer. And and subsequent to the World War II era, in the Cold War era, you see the corporatized government become militarized. In previous wars, after the war was, we had sort of like a volunteer fire department mentality towards wars for a long time. We would arm and prepare for war, draft soldiers, and then when the war was over, we'd uh, sort of unwind everything and go back to peacetime and just keep a bare bones military. Uh, but after World War II, we didn't do that. We now have a new enemy, which is communism. And so the new mandate is to defend not just America, but defend the world from communist expansion. And this becomes the pretext to militarize government, this corporatized government, militarize it to impose an American reign on the world. And of course, if you're going to do that, you have to enforce it. People aren't going to volunteer for that, not willingly anyway. So you have to grow this military industrial congressional complex, Eisenhower referred to, so that you could maintain peace in the Far East, that you could, and you have these bases spread around all over the world, and you have a presence there so that no one messes with any interests that America deems, uh, important to its national security. And of course, the new weapon is nuclear weapons, and so we're in a race to continue to nuclearize, so to speak, because I know the Russians are trying to catch up. And this is the advantage that we have. This is the trump card, so to speak. And we learned that during the Eisenhower administration, we had this massive buildup of nuclear weapons. And then when Kennedy became president, we had this, and of course, too many to count CIA covert operations as well. And Kennedy comes into power, he begins trying to unwind the nuclear part of this equation because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But for a while, the covert operations continued. And then we realized that these were causing problems for America as well. He starts trying to unwind them as well, starts trying to stop them and figure out a new approach to national security. Anyway, the interventionist mindset the United States had was constant. Anywhere in this world, you saw it first with Truman, with respect to the Middle East, Greece, Turkey. We the Truman Doctrine was that we would, uh, if requested, the American government, American military, or American money would show up to help any country in the Middle East or anywhere else around the world that requested our help to stop communist expansion into their country. And then in Eisenhower, you see it again. You know, we're using as a pretext communist expansion to overthrow governments in Iran and Guatemala and try to overthrow in Cuba. We're uh, we're just playing whack-a-mole all over the world. And of course, this is creating this. Remember George Washington for a long time. Our tradition was George Washington, just beware of foreign entanglements, and that's how we operated as a country for over 100 years. Now all of a sudden, we're the world's policeman. And that requires a lot of money tied into the military being voted on by Congress to spread around amongst all these different companies that are military hardware companies, military contractors, to build these military armaments, these weapon systems, these nuclear missiles, whatever, uh, so that we can maintain a grasp on all of our interests around the world, but also keep the Soviets from expanding. And of course, they're doing the same thing. They're building up their military, and everybody thinks we're headed towards this doomsday scenario where we're going to have this nuclear confrontation between us and the Soviets. And honestly, if it hadn't been for Kennedy and Khrushchev, we might have been. So what you end up with is the personal business interests of these plutocrats making money became conflated with the national security interest under the guise of national security. So these plutocrats are making all this money, getting all these big contracts from Congress on behalf of the Department of Defense, are saying, this is feathering their nest. It's making them wealthy. And you can understand why they would suddenly become very interested in the national security agenda of the United States, because it either is going to benefit them or not. And they would prefer to put in politicians that would continue to vote yes. So here's a couple examples of some of these corporations. The Summa Corporation, Howard Hughes, became one of, for example, President Nixon's favorite National Security Council contractors in the 50s. And he was sort of like Elon Musk before his time. He was an inventor. He's a very eccentric individual, as most inventors are. He invented the spruce goose, pictured here below, which at that time, the original prototype was made out of balsa wood, and a lot of pilots who refused to do the testing on that thing, they looked dangerous. They didn't think it'd get off the ground, so he had to fly it himself. It's become the prototype for the C-5A cargo plane, which that's what this is here. This is a modern version of the Spruce Goose. He invented submarine retrieval vehicles, which go down into the depths of the oceans and retrieve enemy subs that we could pull up and scavenge for parts or try to figure out what made them go. What was the strength and weakness of their submarines, and then all kinds of research and development. So the Summa Corporation was one of these benefactors, one of these private sector benefactors, the national security apparatus. And of course, Nixon and Hughes were tight as, thick as thieves. And Hughes did all kinds of personal favors for Nixon to engender this sort of loyalty going forward, so that his corporate interests would be met going forward. And you had the Bell helicopter during the Vietnam War, which I've mentioned this before. Before the Vietnam War, Bell helicopter was on the verge of bankruptcy. And all of a sudden, when Kennedy was out of the picture and LBJ greenlighted the war, it became a helicopter war. And Bell Helicopters sold 12,000 helicopters to the Pentagon during this time period, which had a hefty price tag of $4.7 million each, brought in $56.4 million to Bell Helicopter, saved the company. Today it's a monster. How about General Dynamics? General Dynamics, a Texas company, which had been a longtime supporter of LBJ, stood to benefit when LBJ became president, obviously. And then when he greenlighted the war, they got the F-111 fighter jet contract, which was a $300 million profit for the company during the war. So here's two companies that, because of the Vietnam War, one is saved from bankruptcy and put it back in the black, and then the other got this huge $300 million profit. Brown Root Construction, another Texas company that had deep LBJ ties. You'll notice a trend with these companies. A lot of them go back to LBJ, and I could get into all the oil companies that come out of Texas. They all had LBJ ties as well. They all did well because of the Vietnam War. Anyway, Brown and Root became one of LBJ's, quote, Vietnam builders. When you look at the history of their projects in Texas, it was a lot of building roads and some bridges and some dams, a few buildings here and there. All of a sudden, they go to Vietnam and they get 90% of all the construction projects. They're dredging canals. They're building roads, bridges, and dams, just like they were in Texas. They're also building military bases. They're also building ships, naval ships, which there's an anecdote where the two founding brothers, George Brown, are actually not brothers, but Mr. Brown and Mr. Root were laughing about how they'd never built a ship before. And they didn't know the front from the back. And but nevertheless, they got the contract because of their relationship with LBJ. So here you just see and I've spun it forward here a little bit to show just how much the deep state was profiting from all this military spending. You know, this is a 2011 graph that you can see juxtaposed against all the other major industrialized nations of the world who spend total $695 billion in 2011 on all their military spending. Uh, it is outpaced by one country, the United States, who spent at that time $711 billion. And of course, it's gone up since then. And so, you know, you can quickly tell someone's priorities. My dad used to say, just look at a person's checkbook. That tells you what a person's priorities are. Well, America's priority is very clearly military spending. This is what I mean. After World War II and during the Cold War, we became the militarized, corporatized government. It was all about maximizing profits and benefits for itself at the expense of the American taxpayer. And it used as a pretext national security to uh, grow and grow and grow this military to the point where it became the tail wagging the dog, so to speak. In 2016, the Navy commissioned the USS Gerald R. Ford, pictured here. That ship, just one ship, cost $13.2 billion to build, which if you go back and compare it to the 1950 military budget, the cost of that one ship was equivalent to the entire military budget in 1950. So you see the trend lines. Uh, Now, fast forward to 2025. Last figure I gave you was 2011. Again, U.S. military spending versus the field. By 2025, this year, U.S. military spending is approaching $1 trillion. It's 962 billion. And you compare that to the world, and you can see we are just slightly as one country behind what the world is spending total. And everybody talks about the threats that we face, and we do face threats, especially if these countries unite together against us. But if it's just one versus one, it's almost laughable when you compare the amount of money we spend on military spending versus the world. And of course, this is necessary, the argument is, because we have bases all around the world. We have a military presence all around the world. And just to maintain that, it's actually forcing our hand now. We really don't have any choice over the matter. Um, and presidents get into office promising, they're going to balance the budget, they're going to cut the deficit or the debt, or they're going to do this, they're going to do that, they're going to spend more money on this domestic program or that domestic program. Then they get in, find out the facts of life, and realize, holy cow, the military commitments are such that our hands are tied. The amount of the budget that is what we call discretionary spending, what we can actually choose what we want to spend, is very small compared to the amount of money that we have to spend to maintain what we've already built. Uh, so uh, this new business model, which these plutocrats realized quite quickly after World War I, had decided if we ever have another war of that magnitude, we're not going to let it end because this new business model, continuous warfare, is so lucrative. So Vietnam, the war, it wasn't the immediate successor of World War II. You had a Korean War in between there. Vietnam, the war that Kennedy was going to stop and prevent from happening. That war ends up becoming the most expensive war in Cold War history. In today's dollars, it cost over $1 trillion spread over the span of 4 different presidents. And then and of course, that was just a sub part uh, of the overall Cold War, which lasted, from 45 to 91. You're talking about 45, 46 years. That was worth $10 trillion in today's money over a 46-year span. Again, now remember, Kennedy had two objectives in a second term. One was to pull out of Vietnam, no Vietnam War, and the second was to end the Cold War in a second term. Now, this becomes a real problem for these deep state plutocrats who are saying we stand to lose $1 trillion if we don't have Vietnam War. We stand to lose $10 trillion if we don't have a continuation of the Cold War. So very quickly, it becomes obvious to this national security apparatus and the industry that feeds it what side their bread is buttered on. It's not Kennedy's side. The Pentagon budget in 1950, 5 years after World War II, and it was a mere $13 billion, which was a little bit less than it cost to build that USS Gerald Ford we just saw. By 1961, a decade later, it's uh, 47 billion. It's quadrupled. And then by the time you get to 75, it's 100 billion, which means it's doubled again. And by the time you get to 86, it's 170 billion. By the time you get to 2010, it's 664 billion. And then by the time you get to 2018, it's 686. And the 2025 proposed budget military is 962 billion. And, you know, you're talking in 75 years. There should be an increase, obviously, but this is ridiculous. We've gone from 13 billion to almost 1 trillion. And that is a lot of money that is driving a lot of decisions, a lot of votes. Uh, and it is the beast, the behemoth, that every president is forced to wrestle with subsequent to, during the Cold War and subsequent to, even up to and including today. Yeah, and it's gotten out of control. And you say, well, what are we using to justify all that spending? Well, it's again continuous war. You look at all that budget and all that money being spent, and obviously you're going to have to justify it. And look at all the wars that we have fought. We went all these years from George Washington to the Civil War. We went all those years with very little warfare, and then all of a sudden we start getting a taste for it because of the money it's involved. And we get our first foreign war, Spanish-American War, and then right on the heels of that we get World War One, and on the heels of that we get World War Two, and then we just transition because of this new business model into this continuous war ever since. The Cold War ran for the next 46 years. Contained within the Cold War, you had the Korean War. These are proxy wars, right? The Korean War, you had the Vietnam War, you had the little skirmish in Grenada. You had Beirut in the Middle East. You had Libya, Panama, uh, and then you had the first Persian Gulf War, and then after the Cold War ended, we transitioned into the war in Somalia and Haiti and Yugoslavia, and now we're in Ukraine. Not us, not our forces specifically, but all our money's tied up there. And then from 2001 to today, we've had this continuous war on terror, which forced us into Afghanistan a couple different times, Libya, Iraq, Syria. And so what you see here is uh, this transition from World War II into a Cold War with a bunch of proxy wars included within the Cold War. And then when the Cold War ended in 91, we just seamlessly transitioned into several specific wars like Persian Gulf, number one, Somalia, Haiti, Yugoslavia, Ukraine. And then in 2001, we found the excuse to have a continuous war again, which is the war on terror. And that's where we've been on a war footing ever since World War II. And that's not a coincidence. That's not a mistake. That's not an accident. That is intentional. Uh, Many times you find out that while we're fighting a war or supporting allies in a war through our military hardware and all these big contracts, we are at the same time stoking the next war so that one feeds right into the next. And that's why you have this roster of wars and you have these huge budgets to support all these wars. That's been our history since World War II. Bob Dylan famously uh, wrote an album. He called it Masters of War, and in one of his songs, he's sort of the poet laureate when it comes to the anti-war movement. And he says it this way, quote, "Come you masters of war, you that build all the guns, you that build the death planes, you that build the big bombs, you that hide behind walls, you that hide behind desks. I just want you to know I can see through your masks. Let me ask you one question. Is your money that good? Will it buy you forgiveness? Do you think that it could? I think you will find when your death takes its toll, all the money you made will never buy back your soul." And you know, that's This is why, in the aftermath of the JFK assassination, other countries look at us and they say, "Hey, you've become the same third world banana republic that we are. You killed your own president so you could make money off warfare," and that's not unique to uh, you. It's going on. It's going on everywhere we look. But don't pretend like it's not happening, because we see, just like Bob Dylan said, we see through your masks, and that's why we've lost the moral high ground. The United States is no longer the leader of democracy around the world, because people see how, again, just like my dad said, our priorities. Just look at our checkbook, and they're making the same judgments. So from 1868 to 1918, and this is going back to chapter 1, 2, and 3 of this series. The power elites, which are these private sector corporate owners, uh, their response to pushback from workers when they exploited workers, took advantage of them, underpaid them, uh, uh, took advantage of women and child labor, et cetera, et cetera. Uh, their response was always force. When the workers tried to unionize, they used force. The Pinkertons, the National Guard, judges. When when the Chautauqua and progressive movements had, they always resorted to force to try to stop any uh, reform efforts, because again, they don't care about public interest. It's only about maximizing profits, and they had a business model that was profiting them. Now, when you fast forward to World War II era and beyond, up to and including today's time, the corporatization and militarization of the U.S. government, uh, the plutocracy, the military industrial congressional complex, the deep state, whatever you want to refer to it. Now, this ultra vires doctrine is the operating principle of the public sector as well. It's not uh, just in the private sector anymore. And so, uh, in order to enforce this new exploitation of the American taxpayer, in this case, they use the words national security to justify everything. Um, so the question is, what if in this new era of national security, where it's patriotic to support this uh, empire building, all this American taxpayer money being set aside for this military buildup, etc. What if pushback against this now came from against the deep state now came from the White House? What if you run into a president at some point that says, "Okay, we got to stop this. Enough is enough. We can't keep this is unsustainable." We saw how they resisted the in the private sector. We saw how they resisted pushback from workers and from communities and reform efforts. They used force. Well, what if now, or at some point during this buildup during the Cold War, what if the pushback against the deep state came from inside the White House? So the question is, how far would this deep state be willing to go to maximize these profits, to continue to maximize these profits, to continue down this road at the expense of the public interest? How far would they be willing to go, all in the name of national security? Would it be willing to sabotage a peace summit? In 60, Eisenhower was scheduled to go to Paris for the Paris Peace Summit with Khrushchev. And that thing came to a crashing halt because we flew a U-2 plane over the Soviet Union and they shot it down. And we'd been denying all these years that we'd been spying on them with these U-2 planes. The only reason they shot it down is because Lee Harvey Oswald was over in the Soviet Union at that time, and he gave them the secrets. For years we've been flying it over, and they couldn't shoot it down. They tried, they couldn't. All of a sudden, when Oswald goes over there, he gives them the information that makes it possible for them to shoot it down. The international incident that came from that sabotaged the peace summit. And right on the heels of that, Oswald came back to the United States. I believe he was sent over to the Soviet Union with that information to give those secrets to the Russians, so and then we would send that plane over right before the peace summit, and they would shoot it down. It would cause the international incident, which would sabotage the peace summit and keep the Cold War going. There was some rumblings that we might actually negotiate a peace settlement and the Cold War would end. Well, when it got sabotaged and Khrushchev got mad and stormed out, and flew home, that was the end of that. The Cold War continued. And that's when we recalled our spy. We brought him back for his next mission. I believe that was his first mission. Anyway, question is, would it be willing to sabotage a peace summit? I believe the answer to that is yes, because I believe they did. Would they be willing to assassinate a president and any other peace candidates during this period of time that threatened the money spigot? Well, I believe the assassination of JFK was for that purpose because he was trying to end the Vietnam War before it started, and then he was going to try to end the Cold War in a second term. And I mentioned here other peace candidates. It wasn't just JFK that was assassinated in the 60s. It was Martin Luther King and RFK. Both of the three loudest voices for peace in the 60s were JFK, RFK, and MLK. All three of them were assassinated. All three of them by our intelligence agencies. All three of them were blamed on patsies. Uh, uh, Sirhan, James Earl Ray, and Lee Harvey Oswald. And and who you think about who replaced him? LBJ replaced JFK, who immediately greenlit the Vietnam War and a continuation of the Cold War. RFK was going to win the 68 election, but instead Nixon won. Nixon was their guy, right? And MLK wasn't replaced by anybody necessarily, but J. Edgar Hoover was deathly afraid he was going to be our first black president. And what was especially threatening about MLK was he had transitioned from just a civil rights leader to now becoming a voice against the Vietnam War. He was assassinated in Memphis when he was there to march for garbage workers, and they weren't all black. A lot of them were whites. He was calling the Vietnam War a poor man's war, or because it was just the poor kids who were getting drafted. All the rich kids were hiding out in colleges. And it was mostly black, but there were a lot of poor whites getting drafted too. And so his base of support was growing beyond the black community into the poor white community. And he thought, man, this could be our first black president. So all the peace candidates in the 60s, it wasn't the warmongers who got assassinated. It was the peace candidates. I don't think that's a coincidence. Would they set up another president to be impeached, all to prevent the end of the Cold War, which would kill their golden goose? We'll get to that with Watergate. You said, well, Nixon was their guy. Why would they set him up to be impeached? Well, look what Nixon did. Nixon was the first U.S. president to travel abroad, to China, to Russia, a period of détente, a relaxation of tensions between us and the Soviets. The Cold War was unwound. He signed several strategic arm limitation treaties with respect to nuclear weapons, SALT treaties, and he ended the Vietnam War right before the re-election in 72. He was a threat to the Cold War continuing. There are different ways to target a political enemy. You don't just have to assassinate him. If you play your cards right, you can impeach him or threaten to impeach him, get him to resign. We'll get to that later. But anyway, I think what you see here is initially it was the private sector that was pushing back against the reform efforts, against the workers who were trying to unionize. But they always used force. And then when ultravires seeped into the public sector, the prescribed remedy for dealing with the pushback stayed the same. They used patriotism and national security as a pretext, as a justification to assuage maybe the guilt that they felt participating in treason. As they said, ultimately, we're saving our country. We're not hurting it. We're saving it. He's the threat. JFK's the threat. RFK's the threat. MLK's the threat. And so that was the justification. But ultimately, they responded in the same way. They used force. They killed people. They killed their political enemies, just like before the private sector used to use force, the Pinkertons, to go after their enemies there. So in a lot of ways, the response was identical. It was the same. It was very consistent, especially when they lost, the judges and the politicians who, you know, when you talk about JFK, he was the president of the United States, and he became the threat. And up till then, they had always had that threat neutralized because they owned them. They owned Eisenhower, they owned Truman, they owned these presidents, and so they they own Congress with all their bribes and stuff. But when JFK stood up to the CIA and stood up to the Pentagon and all this military spending, you'll see we haven't talked about it yet, but he's going to stand up to this continued out of control military spending and these bases being expanded all around the world. He stood up to that. He became a threat. He became a threat. And so uh, and this is a picture, well, famously referred to as Bombs Away LeMay, one of the most famous Joint Chiefs members. He had a very uh, harsh view of JFK, called him a spineless coward. He said he reeks of Neville Chamberlain. Every time JFK got in a head-to-head confrontation with the Russians, instead of using it as a pretext to go to war, to bomb the military, to bomb the missile bases in Cuba, or to invade Cuba, or the issue in Berlin with the tank standoff, he he always found a peaceful avenue out of these situations. And some people would regard that as being smart, but Curtis LeMay said, well, he's a coward. He's an appeaser. And he compared him to Neville Chamberlain, called him a sniveling brat, a morally debased vermin, a cockroach. Not much to be left to the imagination here with regards to Curtis LeMay and his view of Kennedy. Uh, he believed that he was a traitor. All these secret backdoor channels of communication between Kennedy and Khrushchev, and then later Kennedy and Castro, outside the official diplomatic channels, uh, caused suspicion amongst these power elites in the national security apparatus. He's going around us. He's not going through us or using us as part of the process. He's going around us. And the result was, for example, the test ban treaty, he's giving away our nuclear advantage. And then they figured out what his next goal was, which was nuclear disarmament, second term. And they said, that's treasonous. He's a traitor. Uh, LeMay was quoted talking about Kennedy's team of intellectuals that he brought in from Harvard and other Ivy League schools. He said, quote, everyone that came in with the Kennedy administration were the most egotistical people I ever saw in my life. They had no faith in the military. They had no respect for the military at all. They felt that the Harvard Business School method of solving problems would solve any problem in the world. As a matter of fact, I had a man tell me, no, General, this is not the kind of weapon system that you want to use. This is what you need. And he said, this man was in knee pants when I was commanding the division in combat. So there was, you look at that picture I showed you at the very beginning of today's episode of the Joint Chiefs gathered around the Resolute desk in the Oval Office at Kennedy. They're all old guys, and they've been around the block a few times. And this new generation came in with Kennedy who have a different outlook on things and how to solve these problems. It just grated on their nerves. It drove them crazy. They said they don't know what they don't know, basically. Admiral Berg, who was Admiral of the U.S. Navy during his time, said, quote, Mr. Kennedy was a very bad president. He permitted himself to jeopardize the nation. So you see, this is why I include the Joint Chiefs in this, because it was pretty prevalent throughout the Joint Chiefs, this feeling that Kennedy was more than just a national security risk. He was a traitor. I already mentioned it was the General Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who brought Operation Northwoods to Kennedy and proposed it in '62. And Kennedy eventually had to fire him. It was such a crazy notion. And so here you have this growing consensus among the military and intelligence officials that JFK is more than just a dangerous weak link. He's a traitor. And if left alone, if he wins re-election, like it looked like he was going to do, we might not have a country left. And they thought he was, in addition to that, he was a moral degenerate. They knew, as did most people, it was like the worst kept secret in Washington, that JFK was basically a sexual predator. And Hoover himself had used uh, his assets in the FBI to get compromising photographs and information on JFK to use as blackmail against the president on several occasions. One, to keep his job, and they knew that these folks in the know knew that he was hypocritically posing publicly with Jackie and the kids like this family man, and that's how the American people knew him at the time because the media wouldn't even cover it. But they knew who he really was, and they knew that the only reason he was in the White House is because of his daddy, and they knew what his daddy did for a living before, during Prohibition, for example. He ran a bootlegging operation. He was a bootlegger. He worked for the mob, and his connections to the Chicago Mafia basically bought and paid for the 1960 election, and that's the reason he was even in the Oval Office. He was a daddy's boy. By the way, going back to the moral, the affairs and all the different sexual escapades of, JFK, he did use incredibly bad judgment. He had a libido that was just out of control. Some people think it was because of the drugs he was taking to deal with all his back pain. Nevertheless, he had affairs that put him in very tenuous situations, to say the least. For example, at one time he was sharing a girlfriend with Sam Giancana. Judith Campbell was simultaneously the girlfriend of Giancana, or the mistress, and Giancana was sharing his mistress with Kennedy, which opened Kennedy in the White House up to blackmail from the Chicago mob. Another time he was having an affair with a woman named Ellen Ramesh. Ellen Ramesh was right out of the East German Stasi. She was which operated in conjunction with the Soviet KGB. She was a Russian spy, and he was sleeping with her. So, if you are one of these joint chiefs and your job is providing or guaranteeing the national security of the United States, and this is your commander in chief, I can understand. You can almost make an argument for why they thought taking JFK out was actually the patriotic thing to do. They didn't think he was fit to be president. He was sickly, and that wasn't his fault. But his doctor, Max Jacobson, had basically prescribed methamphetamines, and was using them to treat his famous patient just so he could deal with the pain. So, a prejudicial view of JFK would say, well, he was a meth head. He was doped up on meth all the time. And then maybe because of the drugs, or maybe it was just because he was his daddy's son, he was a sexual predator. He was having sex with prostitutes. He was having sex with 18-year-old White House interns down in the pool. He had an affair with Marilyn Monroe, which later blew up in his face, and they had to deal with her, take her out because she was fixing to go public. In fact, he actually impregnated her, and she had this notion in her head that he was going to divorce Jackie and marry her, and she was going to be the first lady. As that became a big problem. And then Judith Campbell, Ellen Ramesh, she's the ladies I told you about. His daddy was a mafia bootlegger, and now he's proven time and time again, at least in their view, that he's weak versus communism. And because of the test ban treaty and his efforts to denuclearize and disarm, at least from a nuclear standpoint, they thought he was willing, and as president, he was able to give away America's nuclear advantage. So they're just filing all these things away and are saying this guy has to be taken out. He has to be before he does too much damage. And I think one of the most interesting ways to look at this is through their eyes, and try to figure out if there's any justification for the kind of treason that this conspiracy committed. So let's just for a second play a little mind exercise here and say, what if they were right? What if the unthinkable possibility is that killing President Kennedy was the only way to protect our national security during the height of the Cold War? Because think about what did not happen as a result of his death. He was going to try to disassemble our nuclear arsenal, but because he was taken out, it did not happen. Um, uh, the efforts that he was making to normalize relations with Cuba stopped once LBJ became president. The National Security Action Memo 263, which was going to end the Vietnam War, was countermanded by a National Security Action Memo 273, which greenlit covert ops in Vietnam and eventually resulted in the Vietnam War. Uh, if you take the long view, you could say, well, because Kennedy was taken out, we maintained a nuclear advantage, which acted as a deterrent to communist expansion. We neutralized Castro, which stymied his efforts to spread his revolution throughout Central America. And in 1991, we won the Cold War. So if you look at it from that point of view, the opportunity to export capitalism and democracy today is only possible because the secret team had the guts to do what was necessary. It wasn't an appetizing thing, but they did what was necessary, the secret team, and took him out in 63. And that's why history turned out the way it is. I would argue against that, saying, well, I mean, I could make many arguments against it, but just one argument, for example, is that uh, we don't have an opportunity to export capitalism and democracy anymore because of the very thing we did in 63. No other country wants to copy us. They don't want to follow our example because they look at us and say, well, how are you any different than the rest of the world? You did to your president what we do to ours. Uh, that's that's not different. That's not unique. That's not something to aspire to. The only opportunity we have to export capitalism and democracy today is by force. They don't follow our example out of their own personal goodwill or choice. They follow if they're forced. And that's really uh, the reason why, if we've had any lasting impact on the world with respect to our way of government or our economic system, our model, it's because we've enforced our system. You know, one of the speeches that Kennedy gave was, we can't force ourselves on the rest of the world. We can't make them follow our example. And they didn't think that was true. They said, yes, we can. Yes, we can. And that became a real sticking point. Two different views, two different world views. Kennedy's view was, uh, let's become a shining city on a hill that other countries want to emulate. And their view was, let's become a shining city on a hill that uh, we we force others to emulate. And it's pretty disparate views. So anyway, uh, what we've done now is lay the groundwork for the national security apparatus and the industries that feed it having motive to want to get rid of Kennedy and other peace candidates that threatened the money spigot, threatened the power structure that they were building, and to do it in such a public way, a gory way that would be an example to future presidents that, hey, we're in charge, and you go win your elections and say whatever you have to say to win your elections. But when push comes to shove, we always get our way. We always get our way. Now, in the next uh, part of this series, we're going to be looking at the other uh, conspirators in this plot and their motives. And so we'll add to this conspiracy pot, not just the national security apparatus and the industries that were feeding it, but there were some other players that had roles to play, important roles to play, that would serve as immunity for all the conspirators. For example, that was LBJ's role. That would help uh, set Kennedy up so that he didn't have the Secret Service protection that he thought he had, so he was vulnerable. That was the Secret Service's role. Uh, and then you get into the mob and the Cubans, and they would play their part as well. So we'll go through all that. But I think I've spent about 2, 3 weeks now talking about the national security apparatus. That's the CIA, the intelligence, that's the Pentagon, and you can see what their motives are. And all these different covert ops that the CIA was engaged in that show not just expertise in matters such as assassination and rigging elections, et cetera, but a willingness to do that, not just on foreign soil, but on domestic soil as well. A willingness to break the law. So now you see, it's not just the CIA, it's the Pentagon. That's why it was a combination effort by the CIA and the Pentagon to present Operation Northwoods to Kennedy in 62. That was the operation to commit acts of terror against American targets on American soil and blame Cuba or the Russians to justify a war. What we're going to see in the assassination of JFK is that exact operational criteria there. It was an American target, JFK, on American soil, Dallas, and the blame was laid at the feet of a patsy who had ties to Cuba and to Russia. And that is now that was the overall operation. Contained within that was the Operation ZR Rifle, which was how they did it. That was the carrying out, and they used the S-Force. These are all related. And of course, the Pentagon needed to be, they all had roles. The CIA was in charge of the overall operation. That the Pentagon needed to be, the military had to be on board with the autopsy, for example, and military intelligence, the setting up of Oswald, etc. So you see where this is headed. But I wanted to lay out the financial motivations so you see just how much money was at stake. And that's the reason why our budgets have exploded now, and how come we've been at continual war. It was a business model that was put in place during World War II so that war would never end. And that's exactly what's happened. War has never ended. We've been at war continuously since World War II. The budgets would explode to support all those wars. That's exactly what has happened since World War II. And anybody who comes into power or becomes an obstacle to this money spigot, this never-ending war policy, will be taken out. Again, ultra vires, maximize benefits, all that money, all that profit at the expense of the American people. American taxpayer has no say in this. It's their money they're stealing for all this military hardware and all these wars. And then you immunize yourself afterwards so you suffer no liability. That is ultra vires. And if it means you have to commit treason, so be it. If you have to aid and abet the enemy in the event where you have your own U-2 planes shot down, or you launch false flags where your own people get killed, so be it. If you have to betray your own country, so be it, into a war that they don't support, so be it. If you have to overthrow your government or kill the king, so be it. So be it. And that is all accomplished by this deep state, this plutocracy, these power elites that is made up of national security apparatus and all the industries that feed it. All right, that's enough for today. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe to my channel, smash the like button, share, and or comment. Until next time, God bless. Thank you.